Our second speaker today is a man recently elected as a Member of Parliament, MP for Rochester and Strood, Mr. Mark Reckless, MP.
Some people feel that Reckless is a slightly unusual name for someone in politics. And I'd like to let you know that most of the rest of my family work as doctors. And when my father was in his medical training, my grandmother used to actually have a faded newspaper clipping of this, perhaps from the Daily Express. And she would have this around in a handbag. She would pull it out, and it said, at his medical school, there was a Dr. Reckless, and he was training with a Dr. Butcher, a Dr. Carver, a Dr. Coffin, and a Dr. De Ath. Now, I didn't become a doctor. I started off as an economist. Now, it's not necessarily the most popular of professions. It's been said that there are three types of economists: those who can count and those who can't. You may have surmised which category I fall into. But having worked as an economist, I then went on a tour of a number of other unpopular professions. I next worked as a management consultant. I then qualified as a lawyer and worked as a corporate lawyer in the city. And I then became a Member of Parliament. Now, I read last week there is only one profession more unpopular than a Member of the Westminster Parliament, and that's a Member of the European Parliament. Now, I hasten to add I've no plans to go there. I don't regret, though, doing the range of jobs that I have done, because I think one of the problems of our politics today is too many people go into politics and work perhaps as a researcher or as an advisor or in PR or as a lobbyist, and then go into Parliament from there. And I think that's led to a sort of, well, I think there's become much more of a single type in politics, which is not a good thing. But I think those politicians have lost confidence and have lost credibility vis-a-vis the outside world. And I think we saw an example of this with the banking crisis. We were told by the bankers that we needed to go in and rescue the banks, and we had very little even legal expertise in the Treasury, and all the legal work was done by one sort of outside city firm. And we got various bankers in as consultants, and surprise, surprise, they recommended that the taxpayers should bail out the banks. Now, I don't agree with that, but I think one of the things that led to it was a lack of knowledge and a lack of confidence among our sort of political class, sort of in the widest sense. And I think this also affects our relations with the EU, because we joined what was then called the Common Market. I think our nadir as a nation in the 1970s, we had lost confidence. It appeared for a transitory moment that there was a European economic model that was successful, and we lacked the confidence to remain an independent nation. And I think we joined the common market at that point as a people who had lost confidence. Yet our politicians still had a certain arrogance. They remembered running an empire, and they thought, I think even at that time, quite unreasonably, that we would come in and they, as the British politicians, would somehow be able to run Europe, that they would divide the French from the Germans, and it would be the sort of British sort of statecraft that set the European pattern. And I think we've learnt that's not the case. And for at least 35 years, we have heard that Europe is moving our way, that we can be in Europe but not run by Europe. That somehow it is moving in a British sort of free trading sort of Europe of nations direction. Yet it is not the case. And both our politicians and I think our civil service have lost confidence in themselves to govern us. They speak as if there is no other option except the European Union, that it would be too risky to do anything by ourselves, as if there were not countries from Australia to Canada, from Switzerland to Norway, who do govern themselves with perhaps half or even a tenth of the population that we do. One thing, though, I note, and it gives me some optimism, is amongst the new members of Parliament, and I don't make this as a partisan point, it just so happens that the electoral arithmetic means most of the new MPs who have come in are Conservatives on this occasion. But I note that sort of many of those, because those who haven't been sort of inured in this political system before, who've had responsible outside careers or come to this with some position of their own, say sort of Zach Goldsmith or Henry Smith, who's run a council, or sort of Richard Drax, who owns most of Dorset, as far as I can see. They have a certain confidence and an ability to take on the sort of consensus of politics that has grown up. And we heard from Mr. Owen about the People's Pledge, and I would encourage any of you who have not signed up to this. It is www.peoplespledge.org. And it is many of those new generations of politicians who are coming through with a greater confidence and knowledge of the outside world, who are signing up and saying it's time for us to give the people their say. We must now have an in or out referendum on Europe. Now, back when I was an economist, as you saw, I can't necessarily count very well, and I got a number of things wrong. But one thing I did get right was the euro. And just as I left my position as an economist, I wrote a book called The Euro Bad for Business. Now, this was back in 1998. And I looked at the various economies across the EU, and I wrote, the United Kingdom and Ireland have the weakest correlation of all with other EU countries. Indeed, it is sometimes negative. And I continued, this suggests that the UK and Ireland would be especially badly affected by monetary union with the continent. With regard to Ireland, which intends to join EMU at the outset, this is already becoming clear with an explosion in bank lending destabilising Ireland. Of all the EU member states, Ireland is easily the closest to the UK. Not only are the two states linked by trade, investment and labour mobility, but their economies are similarly structured. The strains which European monetary union is already causing in Ireland should serve as a vivid warning to Britain. Now, it gives me no pleasure to say so, but 13 years later, how much more true does that ring? And one of the reasons why I believe we must leave the European Union is because even though we feel we've opted out of a European currency union, it seems that somehow we've been opted into a European debt union, such that we are paying the cost of what they describe as these bailouts for peripheral European countries. Now, I'd hasten to add, I don't think Ireland's being bailed out. I don't think Portugal will be bailed out. I think these bailouts are actually to protect, above all, banks, wealthy institutions, and the European Central Bank, who has extended tens, I think now hundreds of billions of credit at short term, charging interest rates of barely 1%, to Portugal, to Greece, to Ireland, to Spain, and has taken, in return for that lending as collateral, if you like, the government bonds of those countries, which are now trading often at no more than 3/4 of their face value. Now, it may well be that the Eurozone wants to replace that massive liability as extended at a 0.5% interest rate with longer-term credit at 6 or 7% interest rates. I can understand why they would want to do that. But I don't know how it is in the interest of the Irish taxpayer to move from owing at 0.5% to owing at 6 or 7%. And I certainly don't understand how it's in our interests, whether through the IMF, whether through the EU, or whether bilaterally, to lend that money, which will simply be used to repay this huge liability that the European Central Bank has extended. I said back in 1998 that EMU could only work in the sense even of holding together if the German taxpayer in particular was prepared to put their hands in their pocket and to subsidise to a very significant extent the costs of these peripheral countries having to have German interest rates which are so unsuited to their needs. I don't know if the German taxpayer will do that, whether they will make that sacrifice or whether the euro will fall apart. But what I do know is this country has opted out of the euro, and we shouldn't be subsidising this European debt union, whether it's for Ireland or for Portugal. As well as the costs of these debt union and these almost unknown liabilities we seem to be picking up through what's meant to be a fund for natural disasters, which our government is not even challenging legally, there is the overall cost of being in the European Union. It went from 5.3 billion as our net contribution in 2009 to 9.2 billion just last year. In 1 year, a 75% increase. And the gross contribution, which is in many ways the more relevant sum, is now around £19 billion a year. In addition to that, we have agriculture, where we have to buy food from within the European Union rather than more cheaply from the best supplier outside, often Australia or New Zealand or the United States. We also have our fisheries, where we had, I think, 70% of the fish in what they now describe as a common European resource. And because no one has an incentive to conserve those fish, they are fished almost to extinction, and there is nothing within the EU that we can do about that. There is the issue of trade. So often people tell us that jobs are dependent on trade with the EU. Yet last year, we ran up a deficit in our trade with the European Union of £47 billion. And we had to earn back some of that deficit by making a surplus with the rest of the world. In every single year, and I think Ian Milne will have the details of this much better than I do, but I believe every single year since we've joined the European Union, our country has had a deficit in our trade with the EU, which we have made up in a surplus with the rest of the world. And given that the EU benefits so much more from selling to us than we do by selling to them, it strikes me as inherently unlikely that if we were to insist on our independence, that somehow they would be in a position to punish us for that, because it is not usual for the salesman to hold the whip hand over his customer. We are told that we export more to Belgium than we do to China. But that is precisely the problem. And it is only by reorientating our export industries from a declining market in Europe to the growing markets of Asia and Latin America, and indeed now more before Africa, that we can actually expect to see the growth that we need in our economy. Now, I think last week or the week before, we had a new study from the Bruges Group, which showed that the biggest gain to restoring our independence, to governing ourselves, to leaving the EU, was not just the sums I've given in terms of the amount we pay every year, not just what's happening in terms of trade, not just fisheries and agriculture, but what it would do in terms of regulation, the ability to actually set laws that in our own interests, rather than having a qualified majority of other countries make laws for us. Now, of course, if an exporter wants to sell to France or to Germany or anywhere into the EU, just as you sell anywhere else, you have to ensure that your goods and services meet the regulations of those countries you're selling into. But that is no reason to apply the same regulations to not just the 15% of our trade that's with the EU, but the 15% that's outside and the 70% of trade that is just within this country, where we would be able to have a regulatory regime which would suit us rather than suit a particular group of markets that we sell into. And it's by having that ability to govern ourselves and set our own regulations that I believe we would see the strongest gain in our prosperity if we restored our independence. After all, it is Switzerland and Norway, who are outside the EU, who are the richest economies in Europe. Before I close, I'm an economist, but I don't believe that this is simply an economic case. We heard from Mr. Ogan about the Battle of Britain, and it is just 70 years ago that the bravest part of the Battle of Britain was fought here, above our heads, in these skies. And in an age where it's become perhaps fashionable to denigrate the achievements of previous generations, that event is still largely remembered for what it was, an occasion on which the independence of these islands and the fate of Western civilization rest on the heroism of a few young men. What would they think of us, those pilots of our generation, if they could see us now giving away in peacetime the very freedoms that they defended with force of arms? Above all, the freedom to live under our own laws, under our own people, and under our own parliament. Britain is more than a star on somebody else's flag. Our prosperity demands that we govern ourselves. It's time for an in-out EU referendum so we can vote for an independent Britain.